December 17, 1941. The Arctic night stretched endlessly across the Barents Sea, a black void broken only by the dim glow of navigation lamps and the faint shimmer of northern lights. Across that frozen expanse, a convoy of Allied merchant ships pushed eastward, their decks sheathed in ice, their hulls creaking beneath the weight of frost. The men aboard chipped at frozen rigging with numb hands, their breath crystallizing instantly in the subzero air. They knew that every hour brought them deeper into danger, into waters where the enemy waited. The sea itself was a relentless adversary. Waves rose like black mountains, crashing across the decks and freezing solid where they fell. Machinery groaned under the strain, and lifeboats hung stiff with ice, useless if ever needed. A sailor later wrote that the cold was a living thing, clawing at skin and bone, never leaving you, never letting you forget how quickly it could kill. In these conditions, exhaustion was constant, and fear was a companion as familiar as the man standing watch beside you. But nature was not their only enemy. Beneath the surface, German U-boats prowled silently, their commanders trained to wait for the perfect moment to strike. From the skies, reconnaissance aircraft shadowed the convoys, ready to summon bombers or direct surface raiders. Every flicker on the horizon, every strange shadow, carried the threat of sudden death. One sailor remembered the eerie silence before an attack, broken only by the hiss of the wind, a silence that told them the enemy had found them. Then came the first warning. Flares burst above the convoy, casting a ghostly light over the ships below. Within moments, the drone of engines filled the sky as Luftwaffe bombers cut through the snowstorm. Searchlights flickered to life, stabbing upward into the night, but the sky was already alive with fire. Explosions thundered across the waves as bombs tore into the sea, sending geysers of water and ice skyward. Merchantmen shuddered under the impact, their cargoes of fuel and ammunition igniting in sudden infernos. From above, pilots later recalled the sight of flames spreading across the convoy like brush fire, each explosion illuminating the frozen sea in a grotesque display of light and death. For the men below, the horror was immediate and inescapable. Anti-aircraft gunners clung to their weapons, fingers raw from frostbite, firing blindly into the blizzard as bombs whistled down. Orders were shouted through frozen lips, often drowned by the roar of engines and the crash of shells. When ships were struck, the sea became their tomb. Men thrown into the water stood no chance. In temperatures below freezing, survival could be measured not in minutes, but in seconds. Witnesses described comrades disappearing beneath the black waves, their cries swallowed instantly by the storm. To fall overboard was to vanish, claimed by waters colder than death. And yet, even in the face of annihilation, the convoys pushed forward. Destroyers weaved through the chaos, laying down smoke screens to shield the merchant ships. Sailors fought not only the enemy, but also the ice that threatened to immobilize their ships completely. "We had no choice," one survivor recalled. "It was fight the sea, fight the Germans, or die." So we fought. By dawn, the convoy was scattered and scarred. Some ships burned, their wreckage drifting in the snow-filled wind. Others limped eastward, determined to reach Murmansk despite the losses. Above them, the Arctic sky grew pale, its brief daylight offering no comfort, only the stark sight of destruction across the frozen sea. This was the reality of the Arctic convoys, voyages through a frozen hell where the elements and the enemy combined to create the most dangerous sea route of the Second World War. Each mission was a gamble with death, but one that had to be taken. For these men carried more than cargo. They carried the lifeline of an ally, the hope of survival for a nation under siege. And so the question emerges: why were men asked to endure such torment? What compelled the Allies to risk so much, sending convoys into this frozen gauntlet again and again? To answer that, We must step back from the storm and see how a global war forced desperate choices, and how the icy Arctic became a lifeline to the Eastern Front. The devastation of the Arctic seas was not endured without reason. To understand why men sailed into those frozen waters, one must look back to June 22, 1941, when Adolf Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa. In a matter of weeks, millions of German soldiers surged across the Soviet frontier, smashing through defenses and driving deep into the heart of the Soviet Union. By autumn, the Wehrmacht stood at the gates of Moscow. Leningrad was under siege, and the Red Army reeled from catastrophic losses. The Soviet Union, though vast, was bleeding. Factories had been relocated east beyond the Urals, but they lacked time and resources to meet the enormous demand. The Red Army was short of tanks, trucks, aircraft, and even basic rations. Stalin pleaded with his new allies in London and Washington. Without supplies, the Soviet Union might collapse. For Britain, still standing alone against Nazi Germany in the West, keeping Russia in the war was not charity. It was survival. Churchill knew that if the Soviet Union fell, Germany could turn its full strength on Britain. Thus, the Allies turned to the Lend-Lease program. Conceived by President Franklin D. Roosevelt earlier in 1941, it promised to supply Britain, and now the Soviet Union, with war material, everything from food and boots to locomotives, trucks, fuel, tanks, and aircraft. But the challenge was immense: how to deliver such supplies across a world consumed by war. The Arctic route emerged as the fastest and most direct solution. Ships could sail from ports in Scotland, Iceland, and later northern England, threading through the Norwegian Sea and around the North Cape to reach Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. The journey was short, roughly 2,000 nautical miles, but every mile cut through waters prowled by German U-boats, shadowed by Luftwaffe aircraft, and threatened by surface raiders like the battleship Tirpitz. The convoys would pass within striking distance of occupied Norway, where German bases bristled with submarines and aircraft. Yet despite the danger, the route had one decisive advantage: speed. Alternative passages through the Persian Gulf or across Siberia were slower, requiring weeks or months to move cargo. The Arctic offered urgency, and in 1941, urgency was everything. The Soviet Union's survival depended on immediate reinforcement. For the men who sailed these waters, the environment itself was as lethal as the enemy. In winter, ships braved perpetual darkness, navigating seas choked with drifting ice. Waves crashed onto decks, freezing instantly into jagged, weighty shells that threatened to capsize ships if not hacked away with axes. In summer, the endless daylight brought no reprieve. Instead, it exposed convoys to German reconnaissance aircraft that could stalk them for hours before calling in bombers or submarines. Sailors endured polar nights and midnight suns, their bodies strained to the breaking point by fatigue and cold. The supplies they carried revealed the lifeline's importance. By the war's end, the Arctic convoys had delivered over 7,000 aircraft, 5,000 tanks, 8,000 tractors, hundreds of thousands of trucks, and millions of tons of food, fuel, and ammunition. But in late 1941, when the first convoys set sail, the outcome was uncertain. Each ship carried not only material, but also the fragile hope of keeping the Eastern Front alive. A British sailor later reflected that they did not think of strategy, as they chipped ice from their guns or stood watch in frozen silence. "We only knew the Russians needed what we carried," he recalled, "and we had to get it there, no matter the cost." The convoys were thus more than logistics. They were a bond of survival. Every ton of steel, every crate of food, every aircraft lashed to a merchant ship's deck represented Allied determination to resist Hitler together. They were a message to Stalin that the Western powers would not let him fight alone. But this lifeline came at a terrible price. The Arctic was not just a corridor of supply, it was a gauntlet of death. Ahead lay the full fury of the Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe, waiting to break these convoys apart. And as the war deepened, the Arctic seas would become a battlefield like no other. From the outset, the Arctic lifeline demanded more than isolated voyages. It required discipline, coordination, and above all, unity. Out of this necessity, the WWII's convoy system was forged, steel columns of merchantmen shielded by warships, moving as one through some of the most hostile waters on Earth. The process began in Britain. Merchant vessels loaded their cargoes in ports such as Liverpool, Glasgow, and Reykjavik, before assembling in the sheltered waters of Loch Ewe in northwest Scotland. There, convoys were formed and codenamed with Stark Simplicity, PQ for eastbound voyages to the Soviet Union, and JW for later convoys, while their return journeys bore the designations QP and RA. Each convoy could include 30 to 40 merchant ships, carrying cargo that could mean the difference between survival and collapse on the Eastern Front. Tanks were lashed directly to open decks, their turrets bound in tarpaulin. Aircraft lay in crates, stacked like lumber, while thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, and food filled the frozen holds below. But merchantmen alone could not withstand the onslaught waiting in the Barents Sea. To guard them, the Royal Navy and, later, American warships formed escort groups. At their core were destroyers, sleek and fast, armed with depth charges, torpedoes, and guns to ward off U-boats. Corvettes and minesweepers added strength, their crews often young and inexperienced, but bound by grim duty. Above all, heavy units sometimes accompanied them, cruisers, and on occasion, battleships like HMS Duke of York. Their very presence was a deterrent intended to counter the shadow of the German battleship Tirpitz, lurking in Norwegian fjords. Life within the convoy was an exercise in endurance. The Arctic climate imposed hardships that tested even hardened sailors. Ice built up relentlessly on superstructures, threatening to capsize ships under its weight. Men worked for hours with axes and hammers, breaking frozen sheets from gun mounts and lifelines. Frostbite was common. Fingers split and bled in the cold. Yet duty demanded they remain at their posts. Food was another trial. Hot meals were a rarity, often reduced to frozen bread or tinned rations swallowed quickly in the frigid air. Water froze in pipes, leaving men to chip ice for washing or cooking. Sleep came in brief, restless intervals, interrupted by watch rotations and the constant need for vigilance. As one seaman later recalled, "The cold got into your bones, and the fear into your mind. You never knew if the next hour would bring daylight or death." Psychological strain weighed as heavily as the cold. The men lived with the knowledge that German eyes watched them constantly. Reconnaissance aircraft shadowed the convoys from high above, reporting their position to U-boats lurking beneath the waves. Every splash could be the sign of a torpedo. Every change in the drone of the wind could mask the approach of enemy bombers. The tension was relentless, a drumbeat that never ceased until the convoy reached Murmansk or Arkhangelsk, if it reached them at all. Yet within this crucible, solidarity emerged. Merchant seamen and naval escorts alike shared the dangers, the cold, and the thin line between survival and annihilation. The convoy system was not merely logistics, it was camaraderie under fire. Ships sailed in close formation, their captains relying on one another, knowing that if one fell, the rest must press on. To scatter meant disaster. To remain united was the only hope of survival. Every successful arrival in Soviet ports validated their struggle. Tanks rolled from holds onto frozen docks, aircraft were reassembled on icy runways, and crates of food fed soldiers and civilians alike. For the crews, each delivery was a victory measured not in medals, but in lives sustained. They endured because they had to, because failure meant more than lost ships. It meant abandoning an ally, and perhaps the war itself. But the system, no matter how strong, could never erase the danger. Ahead lay the full fury of German resistance, waiting in Norway's fjords and beneath the Arctic waves. The convoys, bound together by steel and resolve, were about to face their greatest trials in battles that would test not just endurance, but survival itself. The Arctic convoys sailed not only against nature, but against a formidable enemy determined to crush them at every turn. From occupied Norway, the Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe built a deadly gauntlet of steel and fire, intent on severing the fragile lifeline to the Soviet Union. For the Germans, these convoys represented more than supply ships. They were proof of Allied resolve and a direct threat to Germany's Eastern war effort. The geography favored the hunter. Norway's long fjords provided ideal bases for U-boats, surface raiders, and aircraft. German submarines patrolled the Norwegian and Barents seas, lurking silently, waiting for the telltale silhouettes of merchant ships against the Arctic horizon. Above, Focke-Wulf FD-Tide, Bajiti-Tide, WWII, 200 Condor reconnaissance planes prowled the skies, shadowing convoys for hours before radioing precise positions to U-boats and bomber squadrons. Each sighting meant the hunters were closing in, and looming behind it all was the specter of the Kriegsmarine's surface fleet. Heavy cruisers like Admiral Hipper and Lützow prowled the coast, while the battleship Tirpitz, Germany's Queen of the North, remained anchored in the fjords, a constant threat. Though Tirpitz rarely sailed into combat, her very existence tied down British battleships and sowed fear in every convoy commander. A single sortie from her guns could annihilate an unprotected convoy. The German gauntlet reached its most tragic triumph in the summer of 1942. Convoy PQ-17, bound for Murmansk, consisted of 35 merchant ships carrying tanks, aircraft, trucks, ammunition, and fuel. Cargo desperately needed by the Red Army. Protected by a strong escort of destroyers, cruisers, and even distant battleships, it set out in late June under the endless daylight of the Arctic summer. The Germans were waiting. Shadowed from the skies, PQ-17 quickly became a target. Luftwaffe bombers struck repeatedly, while U-boats closed in. Yet the convoy endured until July 4th, when fear of the Tirpitz changed everything. Reports suggested the great battleship had put to sea. Convinced disaster was imminent, the British Admiralty issued a fateful order. The convoy was to scatter. Merchant ships were told to break formation and head individually for Soviet ports. Escorts were pulled back to prepare for battle with the expected German surface fleet. The order doomed them. Once the convoy dispersed, its unity, its greatest defense, was lost. Lone ships, stripped of protection, became easy prey. U-boats and aircraft pounced without mercy. Over the next days, 24 of the 35 merchantmen were sunk. Survivors described seas littered with burning oil and debris, men clinging to wreckage before succumbing to the freezing waters. One sailor recalled the silence after a sinking. No screams, no shouts, just the hiss of fire on the sea, and then nothing. The Tirpitz never arrived. She had never even approached the convoy. PQ-17's destruction was not the result of her guns, but of the fear she inspired. It was a catastrophe for the Allies, a gift to German propaganda, and a scar that never left the men who survived. Yet even in tragedy, the convoys pressed forward. Each disaster forced the Allies to adapt. Stronger escorts, better air cover, improved tactics. The Germans had committed vast resources to the Arctic, submarines, aircraft, and capital ships that might have been used elsewhere. Their constant efforts to break the convoys drained their strength, tying them to a frozen battlefield that yielded few decisive victories. For the men at sea, the gauntlet was never forgotten. Every watch, every horizon scan, carried the memory of PQ-17, a reminder that in these waters, a single order or a single mistake could mean annihilation. But they continued, because the convoys were not optional. They were essential. The German gauntlet had shown its fangs, but it had not broken the lifeline. And as the war dragged into late 1943, the balance of power at sea began to shift. The convoys would grow stronger, the hunters weaker, and the tide of war would slowly turn against Germany. By late 1943, the Arctic War at sea had begun to change. The convoys that once seemed doomed to certain destruction were now sailing with a new measure of confidence. The balance of power was shifting, slowly but decisively, toward the Allies. The transformation came from a combination of technology, tactics, and sheer endurance. Long-range aircraft, such as the consolidated B-24 Liberator, began patrolling the vast expanses of ocean that had once been deadly air gaps, regions where no Allied plane could reach, and U-boats had hunted unchallenged. Now, convoys could count on watchful eyes above, reducing the element of surprise that had so often favored the Germans. Escort carriers, small converted ships bristling with aircraft, became floating shields, bringing air cover directly into the convoy columns. What had once been merchantmen trudging alone under the guns of a few escorts now looked more like fortified fleets, able to fight back in every domain. At sea level, the escorts themselves grew deadlier. Destroyers, frigates, and corvettes were fitted with radar to detect surface raiders and even periscopes breaking the water's surface. Hedgehog anti-submarine weapons added another dimension. Unlike depth charges, which exploded blindly, Hedgehogs launched forward-firing projectiles that detonated only upon contact. This allowed escorts to attack with precision, forcing U-boat commanders to dive deeper and take greater risks. The results were tangible. Convoys designated JW and RA, the code names for winter runs to and from Soviet ports, saw far fewer losses compared to the disasters of 1942. In early 1944, convoy JW-55B sailed for the Soviet Union with 19 merchant ships under heavy escort. The Germans attempted to intercept with the Scharnhorst, one of their last operational battleships. But this time, the Allies were prepared. British forces intercepted and sank the Scharnhorst at the Battle of the North Cape on December 26, 1943. It was a decisive blow. Never again would a German surface ship attempt to assault an Arctic convoy. For sailors aboard the convoys, life was still brutally hard. The Arctic did not grow any kinder with time. Men chipped ice from gun mounts, stood long watches with faces raw from windburn, and ate rations so frozen they had to be hacked apart with knives. Yet there was a difference in morale. One seaman later recalled that by 1944, we no longer felt like bait. We felt like a fleet. The sense that they were part of something larger, a lifeline sustaining millions of Soviet soldiers, lent their struggle meaning, and the impact was enormous. By 1945, the Arctic convoys had delivered over 4 million tons of supplies. Tanks rolled off ships in Murmansk. Aircraft were assembled in Arkhangelsk, and endless streams of food, fuel, and ammunition poured into the Soviet war effort. These supplies played a crucial role in enabling the Red Army to recover from the disasters of 1941 and launch the massive offensives that would eventually smash through to Berlin. For the Germans, the tide was unmistakable. U-boat losses mounted, and their crews faced an increasingly futile fight. Aircraft fuel, spare parts, and trained men grew scarce, while Allied dominance in the air and sea left fewer opportunities for success. The Arctic, once a hunting ground, became a graveyard for submarines. The convoys had turned from desperate gambles into reliable operations. The cost was still high, But now the lifeline was secure, and with every successful run, the end of the war drew nearer. The Arctic remained a frozen hell, but by 1944 it was one in which the Allies, not the Germans, held the advantage. What had begun as a perilous gamble had become a strategic triumph. Behind the statistics of tonnage delivered and ships sunk lay the true price of the Arctic convoys: human lives. More than 3,000 sailors and merchant seamen never returned from those frozen seas, their bodies claimed by the Barents and Norwegian waters. Dozens of ships lie there still, rusting beneath the waves, silent tombs for crews who endured some of the harshest conditions of the Second World War. For those who served, the danger was relentless. Frostbite stalked every man on deck, creeping into fingers that clutched frozen steel gun mounts and into boots that stayed wet for days. Medical facilities aboard the merchantman were rudimentary, often little more than a few bandages and morphine. A sailor wounded by shrapnel or burned in an explosion had slim chances of survival. Even those who escaped the enemy faced nature's cruelty. In water barely above freezing, a man lasted minutes before unconsciousness set in. One survivor later recalled watching comrades stiffen like statues at their gun posts, killed by exposure even as they tried to return fire. The suddenness of death was another torment. Merchantmen laden with ammunition or fuel could vanish in an instant, torn apart by a torpedo or bomb. Men spoke of the deafening roar of explosions, the blinding flash that turned night into day, and then the sea swallowing everything. Survivors clung to life in open lifeboats, surrounded by burning oil slicks, their hands too frozen to grip the oars. A gunner from one of the PQ convoys remembered how, after his ship was struck, the sea itself seemed to burn. The waves carried fire with them. We rode through smoke, praying for a gap. Courage, however, was as common as despair. Time and again, men continued to fight their ships, even as they sank beneath them. Escorts raced back into flaming seas to pluck survivors from the water, knowing a torpedo could strike at any moment. On board the merchantmen, gunners remained at their posts, loosing round after round until flames forced them to abandon ship. Their determination was not born of glory, but of necessity. Each crate of ammunition, each tank strapped to a deck, each barrel of fuel was a lifeline to soldiers on the Eastern Front. Those who survived carried scars long after the war. Some bore the visible marks: frost-bitten fingers, damaged lungs from smoke inhalation, or burns that never fully healed. Others carried invisible wounds, the memory of night raids, of ships exploding around them, of comrades disappearing into black water. Many veterans later admitted to waking in the night, reliving the sound of dive bombers or the hiss of icy waves slapping against lifeboat sides. Yet, despite their sacrifice, for decades the men of the Arctic convoys felt forgotten. Their ordeal was overshadowed by the titanic clashes at Stalingrad, the beaches of Normandy, and the island campaigns of the Pacific. In Britain, victory medals for Arctic service were delayed. Their recognition folded into the broader Atlantic star. In the Soviet Union, the convoys were acknowledged as vital, but individual seamen often faded into the vast narrative of the Great Patriotic War. Many veterans quietly carried the weight of their memories, unsure if the world truly understood what they had endured. But history tells a different truth. Their service was not only vital but irreplaceable. Without the convoys, the Soviet war effort might well have collapsed under the pressure of German advances. Without their endurance, millions of tons of supplies would never have reached the Eastern Front. The cost was high, measured in lives lost to frost, steel, and fire. Yet those men, merchant and naval alike, left behind a legacy of resilience. They proved that even in the harshest corner of the globe, surrounded by enemies and tormented by the elements, the human spirit could endure. And though the seas kept many of them, Their sacrifice remains etched in history, a testament to courage in the face of impossible odds. By the war's end in 1945, the Arctic convoys had etched themselves into the hidden backbone of Allied victory. From the first desperate sailings in 1941 to the final deliveries in May 1945, more than 1,400 merchant ships carried nearly 4 million tons of cargo across the world's most dangerous waters. Packed within those holds were 7,000 aircraft, 5,000 tanks, hundreds of thousands of trucks, locomotives, foodstuffs, fuel, and raw materials. For the Soviet Union, these convoys represented survival. Without them, the Red Army's ability to resist and eventually counterattack the Wehrmacht would have been crippled. The supplies helped sustain the Eastern Front, where Germany suffered the majority of its casualties, losses that ultimately broke the spine of Hitler's war machine. Winston Churchill himself called the Arctic voyage the worst journey in the world. It was not hyperbole. The route demanded a price in blood and steel, and yet it was endured again and again. The Arctic Ocean, with its freezing gales and pitch-black nights, became both an enemy and a silent witness to courage. For the men who sailed those convoys, the memory was never abstract. It was carved into their bones by frostbite, by sleepless nights, and by the faces of comrades lost. The convoys also reshaped strategy. To protect them, the Allies were forced to commit immense naval resources: cruisers, destroyers, aircraft carriers, even battleships like HMS Duke of York. For the Germans, countering the convoys tied down the battleship Tirpitz, dozens of U-boats, and squadrons of the Luftwaffe that might otherwise have been deployed elsewhere. The Arctic seas became a theater of attrition, one where logistics, endurance, and sacrifice mattered as much as guns and torpedoes. For decades after the war, the Arctic convoys remained overshadowed by the great set-piece battles: Normandy, Stalingrad, Midway. Yet their impact was immense. The supplies that reached Murmansk and Arkhangelsk fueled Soviet offensives that eventually rolled westward, liberating cities from Smolensk to Warsaw, and finally storming Berlin itself. Without that fragile thread of steel and steam linking Britain to the Soviet Union, the war's end might have looked very different. The human cost remained staggering. More than 3,000 Allied sailors never returned, their bodies consigned to the Barents and Norwegian seas. Survivors, when interviewed decades later, spoke less of medals and recognition, and more of the comrades they had left behind. One veteran recalled the endless Arctic night, the bitter winds cutting through his uniform, and the sound of ships breaking apart under torpedo fire. "You never forgot the cold," he said, "but you remembered the faces." Today, memorials stand in Britain, Russia, and Norway, honoring those who endured the worst journey in the world. In Murmansk, an eternal flame burns for the sailors who never saw land again. In Britain, belatedly, veterans were awarded the Arctic Star in recognition of their service. On both sides of the former alliance, wreaths are laid each year, often by frail hands of the few who remain. Their memories carry the weight of sacrifice, a reminder that victory was purchased not only on battlefields, but also on storm-tossed seas. The story of the convoys is also a moral reflection on war itself. They represented the necessity of alliance, the interdependence of nations bound together against tyranny. But they also revealed war's cruelty. Men frozen at their posts, ships vanishing in seconds, families left to wonder if their sons would ever return. It was a campaign fought not for glory, but for survival. And its legacy lies as much in endurance as in triumph. As the documentary closes, we return to where it began: a convoy pushing through the Arctic night. Black seas heave against steel hulls, snow whips across frozen decks, and distant flares mark where danger lurks. In that darkness sailed courage, fragile, human, and enduring. The Arctic convoys were more than ships and cargo. They were lifelines of hope, threads of survival that helped hold an alliance together and hasten the fall of Nazi Germany. They were journeys into frozen hell, and yet, through sacrifice, they became part of history's fragile promise, that even in the bleakest of nights, men will endure, and hope will sail with them.